We are very happy to be here and to have this chance to share some of our work on interpreting in a migration context. You mentioned our project already. You can see the ReTrans logo on the slide. And this was one of our more recent projects, and we will talk about some of the outcomes a bit later. As obvious from our title, we will be focusing on a very specific field of interpreting, that is interpreting in what we named in a transborder migration context. What do we understand by that? We mean interpreting along migration routes, in refugee identification centers, and in first arrival and reception situations. Our particular focus will lie on the means and challenges of preparing interpreters, and ideally also their users, for work in such a setting. And why this focus? Because work in such contexts and specific training for interpreters working in such settings have long been neglected, both in interpreting research and in formalized interpreter education. As most of us know, university-level interpreter training has long focused on more typical fields of interpreting, like conference interpreting or business and diplomatic interpreting, and challenges of other fields such as court or community interpreting, for instance, or more recently crisis translation, were long underrepresented and still are in some countries. Hence why we felt the need to pay more attention to interpreting for refugees as a particularly vulnerable group, also at the university level.
Yes, and we intend to make good use of our 60 minutes together, and we have planned accordingly. So what we like to do is to start out today with a quick recap of some key figures to situate our central theme, namely transborder migration. We will then be moving on to take a quick glance at some of the core themes of interpreting scholarship and literature, and also their impact on setting up and coordinating training and education in transborder migration. And the better part of our talk will be dedicated on discussing particular examples, one of it being ReTrans, and also other examples that we've brought as they are reported in empirical research, advocacy work, and elsewhere. And finally, we hope that we have planned sufficiently enough time so that we have a Q&A together, because we would like to exchange. So in case anything comes up while we are hogging all the talking time, please feel free to type your questions, your comments into the chat. We will make sure to pick them up at the very end of our input. Okay? Great. We're going to start. So in general, we have about 300 million people globally that are considered to be on the move as international migrants. The focus for us, however, in transborder migration particularly lies with those individuals that are fleeing from persecution, war, or other endangering circumstances. And as of 2025, as of this year, we have about 107.3 million people who are considered forcibly displaced. Roughly 66%, so a little over 73 million people find refuge with neighboring countries. So staying close to the country where they originated from is mostly motivated by the choice that they think they're gonna, or by the hope that they're gonna return sooner or later. And in general, more than 2/3 of the countries, so about 71% of the hosting countries, are either low or middle income countries. To cite some more numbers and to put them into context, 67% of those 170.3 million that I cited at the beginning, those people are fleeing either from countries such as Venezuela, the Syrian Republic, Ukraine, Afghanistan, or Sudan. And about 34% of the individuals find refuge either in Colombia, Germany, Turkey, the Islamic Republic of Iran, or Uganda. So between those countries where people are fleeing from or where they are hosted, then there are many, many countries in between where some of the major transit routes are going through. And I'm not sure if any of you have read Valeria Luiselli's book on Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 questions. She's actually talking about one of the major transit routes, namely the Central American route, Other routes would be, for example, the Central Eastern or Western Mediterranean route that all lead into Europe. But further routes would be either the West African route or also the Southeast Asian route. So this is roughly the backdrop of transborder migration for us today. When we take a quick glance at scholarship and interpreting, we have some issues that have been talked about for longer or shorter periods of time, and that are equally important also for interpreting in transborder migration. From scholarship in public service interpreting, we know that people have uneven access to public services, particularly when they are not or not sufficiently proficient in the dominant language or languages spoken by the authorities. And what is also important to know is that in cases where interpreters are providing the linguistic access, a contentious issue have been the diverging role expectations that put interpreters in positions where they have difficulty balancing the demands that come from both parties and to find a way to deal with them. But most important for us in transborder migration is that professionalization has taken different speeds across countries, and also sometimes the direction is going in a different way. For example, there are countries that had a high in professionalization, and now it's being reported that there is some kind of retraction from that. When we think about interpreting in conflict and war, we know that interpreters are facing threats to their bodily integrity, which is extremely important, and that support for interpreters during war and post-war situations is something that is to be considered of, especially when we think about the affiliations that they have with the powers for whom they are working. Some of them are part of the military, but some others are recruited on the ground, so their affiliation is very much also connected to the support that is available for them during the war and after. When we think about interpreting in humanitarian aid, again, we have language hierarchies to think about. Most often there are Western languages that are privileged in those contexts, whereas local or regional languages have to take a step back. And interpreters working there usually have also other profiles and tasks, so translation and interpreting may be one of the tasks, but not the primary one. In this case, it's particularly the ethos or the positionality that is sometimes at odds, because they have to think about the ethos of humanitarian aid, but also of the work of interpreters. And last but not least, an interpreting current or scholarship current that is important for us to think about is, as Sonja already mentioned, translation in crisis and disaster scenarios. And here we know that interpreters are very much affected again by the situations, by the resources that they have to their disposal, and that technology use is becoming more and more dominant, but also that in most cases translation and interpreting is not something that is planned with in disaster management, and so ad hoc solutions are very common, and sometimes they are especially prone to error or inefficiency in the work.
So we would like to continue to briefly address what kinds of challenges have been reported with regard to interpreter training for such contexts. And if we take first a look at the literature on interpreter training and education, we can identify some specific challenges that need to be considered if one plans to provide training or to develop training material and also train the trainers material. One of these issues is that the training landscape is diverse, internationally and also often nationally. Training for such contexts may either be offered at the university level, either undergraduate or postgraduate, but also in extra-university contexts, which again may differ widely as regards length of training, contents of training, admission criteria, final exams, degrees, etc. What most training programs have in common is that trainees may have divergent backgrounds. Training may be needed for speakers of more traditional languages, but also for speakers of languages of limited diffusion. Maria already mentioned this. And this means that training cannot always be offered in a language-specific format between one or two languages, but needs to be delivered in a generic language-independent format. It may also be difficult to find trainers with expertise in this specific context and also the necessary didactic qualifications, particularly when it comes to training for speakers of languages of limited diffusion. And there are also differing expectations among trainees as regards teaching styles and approaches to learning that have to be considered when developing material. And apart from these general issues, there are also particular ones such as curricular needs and financial and staff resources, or the lack thereof, and technology like remote interpreting that need to be considered for training in such a context. So what implications do all these findings from literature have on training design and training organization? We think that we need flexible training designs that can be adapted to different contexts, for instance, in a modular format. Trainings need to be scalable to address the needs of different target groups. And we need to pay attention to training the trainers too. Ideally, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can use findings from research to develop materials that should ideally be open access and can be shared and further adapted and localized and expanded. And secondly, the second point on this slide is there is the topic of what we named advocacy work here. We do not work in a vacuum, but should try to establish and strengthen alliances with strategic partners in the field who can then help us to promote our goals, which is basically more quality in interpreting. And these partners may be international organizations, NGOs, or public service institutions, as some examples. And this advocacy work will also include user training, interprofessional cooperation to foster more exchange between clients of interpreters and interpreters themselves has become a catchword in interpreting studies. And we have one example for today where advocacy work, for instance, has resulted in a larger joint project. And there are more examples of user training and awareness raising also internationally. So this brings me to the last item on this slide. In what follows, we will provide some examples of how we addressed these specific training needs and challenges before the backdrop that Maria just explained. Most of our examples are based on recent projects we were involved in, and some are also the results of long-term collaborations with other stakeholders in this context. For instance, UNHCR, that is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. We are, of course, not the only ones to deal with such challenges and implications for training. For such contexts, other relevant projects with a focus on interpreter training or with the train-the-trainers approach are or were, for instance, and this list here, it is not exhaustive, the Interact project, you might want to take a look at that too, under the lead of the Dublin City University, or the TRAMIC project under the lead of the University of Ljubljana, or the Dialogos project under the lead of the University of Alcalá de Henares. We will later post all the links to these projects and other websites we mention in the chat for you. So starting with examples, we will first take a look at some examples that were developed through the project that was already mentioned, the so-called ReTrans project This acronym stands for Working with Interpreters in Refugee Transit Zones, Capacity Building and Awareness Raising for a Higher Education Context. It was implemented between 2022 and 24 under our lead, that is University of Vienna, but we had 4 other partners, and 3 of those partners are located along the so-called Western Balkan refugee route. Maria mentioned it already, and you can see this on the map here. These were partners from Greece, from Slovenia, and from North Macedonia. The aim of the project was to raise awareness to different challenges of interpreting in a refugee context and to develop materials that can be used both in a university context but also outside a university context. We were in touch with many different stakeholders, with interpreters, interpreter providers, training institutions, users of interpreters, authorities, NGOs in Austria, Slovenia, Greece, and North Macedonia, in the sense of the kind of advocacy work we mentioned, and the input of all these different perspectives and the people we spoke to had a large influence on the design and the content of our training materials. And we also tried to involve our students in the project because we were interested in their views and experience, and they also contributed to some of the materials, for instance, the podcasts. Maria will tell you more about that. So the first example or experience we would like to share from the ReTrans project is a university-based classroom project with elements of what we called hands-on ethnography, and it was based on a constructivist experiential learning perspective. It was led and co-taught by 3 teachers. It was a course that was not part of our regular curriculum, hence a content students had not been much exposed to. And we used also an action research approach to document this part of our project and to explore both teachers' and students' perceptions. Our idea was to use this concept of crisis translation to introduce students to refugee reception situations, which may serve as an example where crisis translation is needed. The project took place right after the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a situation we had not anticipated when planning the project. So translation and interpreting for a very specific group of very vulnerable applicants was a very real need and very much present at this time, both in Vienna and our neighboring countries. And the idea was to provide students both with theoretical content and theoretical input, and also to prepare them for going into the field, paying consideration to general elements of ethnography. For instance, we spoke with them about how to do field work, how to do observations, who to get in touch with, and how to talk to players in the field, how to document their observations and conversations in a field diary, and also paying particular focus on research ethics, like how to deal with vulnerable groups, how to deal with informed consent, positionality, etc. And students were motivated to use the city, that is in our case Vienna, and asked to pay attention to what was going on there and to try to find spots and locations where translation and interpreting was taking place. And if possible, to observe different situations, and if possible, also try to speak people. And on the slides, you can see examples of some of these situations, examples, for instance, what they documented. Here you can see one of the largest train stations in Vienna and an event hall that was converted into a reception hall, or an initial reception center in South Tyrol, or a signage posted by the Viennese Railway Corporation for Ukrainian people arriving from Ukraine. So here in this, the focus was really on translation zones and what was going on in these translation zones. And one main takeaway for us with regards to training was that it is important and fruitful to do such, to employ such a hands-on approach. For students, they largely saw the course as beneficial, and they felt they had learned a lot. They liked this new experience and the different perspectives they got to know. Though for some, the freedom and flexibility we gave them seemed to be a bit difficult. For us teachers, from the teachers' view, it was a bit, at the beginning, a bit disillusioning that despite the course being an optional course, their students' willingness to invest time in reading up on content and discussing it actively seemed a bit limited, at least at the beginning. And our teaching style apparently was not what they had expected. They had expected more passively consumable slides with summarized contents. But at the end, our students felt that the course was beneficial for them. If you're interested in details about this course, you can take a look at the reference at the bottom of this page. The main implications of this pilot course for training is that it is worthwhile to try to introduce new content also in a university content, and that it is fruitful to let students do actual hands-on projects as classwork, but it is time consuming and it needs a lot of preparation, and it needs you to repeatedly explain your goals and aims and expectations.
A second concern for us in ReTrans was also to support institutions and stakeholders with material for their work, especially when they're working with interpreters, and to receive basic information about this. Especially in case they wish to set up multilingual crisis communication, for example. So for this, we opted to produce podcasts, videocasts, and also educational videos. The 3 educational videos are are more of an introductory nature, so they're covering basic information on what settings there are in public service interpreting, codes of ethics, but also strategies and techniques of interpreters when doing dialogue interpreting. And the videocasts that were produced supported 2 major themes. So one was this ever ongoing debate between empathy and professionalism and how to approach both when working as an interpreter. And the second major theme was the Western Balkan routes as a videocast that gives more information on the context that we were working on. The material is either available in English, or when it is in German, Macedonian, Serbian, or Greek, it's subtitled in English. And for the podcast, we again had an elective course in Vienna where students were encouraged to participate and to craft their own podcast episodes, if you like. So the course sought to introduce students to central players in the field, especially in crisis communication, and also to familiarize them a little with the crisis support net landscape in Austria itself. So they were encouraged to reach out to representatives of institutions and organizations to conduct interviews with them, or, if I may say more aptly, invite them in as guests into their podcast episodes, and explore topics particularly through the eyes and the experience of their invited guests. The topics that the students covered were, for example, social media use in managing crisis communication, but also resource management in general, so setting up a reception hall, as you saw in the pictures earlier, prep such centers for large groups of people arriving, but also teaming up, so guiding volunteer workers, particularly managing volunteer interpreter groups. What do you need to consider when you're working with many volunteer interpreters? When you're in charge of them, what do they need, especially in terms of debriefing or in watching the hours that they work per week? And one topic that came up repeatedly in several of the podcasts was the topic of emotions and care when interpreting during a crisis. So especially when thinking about the students' own biographies and their affiliations with people who might have been fleeing from a war or suffering from PTSD, for example. Students in this class reported that they felt particularly supported, and that they also valued the fact that they could bring their own experience into the classroom, their work that they do outside of university, and they contributed to tangible results. So podcast episodes that they again could share with organizations or institutions. Some of the podcasts here that the students produce are also available in English. For example, the complete guide to humanitarian interpreting and No Change in the World without Empowered Women. As Sonja said, you will receive the links afterwards, so you can click through them in case you want to listen to any of them. For the podcast and this specific course for the students, we targeted the goal that we wanted to familiarize the students with crisis communication in general, and also the role of interpreting and translation in crisis communication, and this expected nature behind it, how to deal with that, and with all the unexpected challenges that come with it. We'd like also to share a last example of ReTrans that had a slightly different didactic goal, and namely what was already announced by Jen at the very beginning, namely the interactive stories of ReTrans. They were also produced as part of an elective course. It was called Interpreting Studies Meets Game Studies. It took place at the Center of Translation Studies as well in Vienna. And for this course, we forged alliances with Game Studies. So we invited in two scholars from Game Studies to teach together in a tandem version with two interpreting scholars, and use game-based education and media education to encourage students to write stories. But not just regular stories, but stories that can be turned into interactive stories that can be played online. So students were familiar with traditional storytelling, but this time they had to go one step further and find suitable knots in their own stories that they drafted to create decisions, so challenges for interpreters. And these decisions then span out throughout the stories and can, when they are played, lead to different ends in an interpreted conversation. The students could pick any of the topics that they wished to choose, as long as they're related to transborder migration. The key themes that they picked up were either remote interpreting, interpreting for unaccompanied minors, or also violence among siblings, interpreting for queer refugees, but also self-care for interpreters. All in all, we produced 7 interactive stories. The student versions are 4 of them. You see them on the right side. So the stories all have names. Usually it's the name of the non-institutional client that is interpreted for in the story. What's important here you can see one example, Timur. When you click on play the story, you immediately fill the shoes of the interpreter and you walk through the story as the interpreter, as the main protagonist. For the students, it was important to understand that stories can have different outcomes. So they had to accept the fact that in interpreted conversations, there is not always a full-blown success or failure. Many times it's something in between. And that interpreter-assisted communication is most often goes hand in hand with the work of other professions. So it's not just us, but also the responsibilities of other people we're working with that we like to take into consideration. For us as teacher trainers, this course was particularly interesting because we had to guide the students a little bit through the narratives, but also explain to them how to construct narratives that later go on online and also out into the world, and what kind of stories they would like to share about interpreting when they're talking about it. And as I said, not just identify challenges in interpreting, but go beyond those challenges and find different solutions in a story, how you could address these challenges. Last but not least, we wanted the stories to be playable also for other professions. So when we do stakeholder trainings, that, for example, psychologists or also counselors, social workers could play the stories to be familiarized a little bit more to what it means to interpret for other people. Yes, I think we still have time to share some other examples. We're going to move on from ReTrans to some others.
Yes, the timing is perfect. We weren't sure whether we would have the time, but we would like to share two examples from two other projects. The first one is the so-called Web PSI project, and the second one is the Handbook for Interpreters in Asylum Procedures. And the EU Web PSI project is another European project. Technically, it's not our project, but a project under the lead of the University of Ghent, Katrin Marines and Julie de Wilde. And we, University of Vienna, we were a partner in this project next to other university partners, and also ENPSIT, the European Network of Public Service Interpreting, was a partner, and also reception centers were partners, reception centers in Belgium and in Greece. For details about all the partners, you can take a look at the homepage. It was a project that took place between 2022 and 25, and the overall aim was to address unequal access to interpreting services across Europe. And one particular goal was to strengthen interpreter availability, particularly for speakers with languages of limited diffusion, and another sub-goal to particularly also provide more access for video remote interpreting. And there was a platform for video remote interpreting, for instance, that was also produced in this project. We, however, would like to focus on the train the trainers approach that was also taken in this project, and this was the one contribution where we as University of Vienna also contributed to the development of 8 trained trainers modules, on which we would like to focus a bit in what follows.
Yes, so one part of the project focuses on providing a platform to make interpreting available, like a platform to do video remote interpreting. But the second part of this online resources were also a repository. So in this repository, there are the train-to-trainer materials stored. They were, as Sonja said, particularly targeted at those people who are filling the shoes of trainers or educators, being that in an institution, an organization, as in-house trainers, or also in an adult education center or elsewhere. The 8 modules address specific demands, and they were chosen, the topics were chosen based on a needs analysis beforehand. So the 8 modules include entrance assessment at the very beginning of a training, but also basic interpreting techniques, again, ethics, the public service domain, to get to know the institutions a little bit better. Then they also focus on specificities of video remote interpreting, specificities of interpreting with languages of limited diffusion, and then again also organization of certification testing at the very end, and last but not least also interprofessional training on working with webcam interpreters. So these 8, not all of the modules are openly available, most of them are, but especially the ones that focus on testing, so entrance examination and certification testing, are not available online because all the material comes with ready-to-use examples and also testing sheets. We didn't want to have the entrance assessment tests online for students to find them and have them beforehand. So those 2 models are not available online, but all the others can be used. The modules follow the same structure. So at the beginning, there is some backdrop information, some theoretical tenets that are being sketched out to get a good overview of the specific topics. And in the end, you always have ready-to-use material for trainers in case you like to adapt them to specific localities, but also to specific target groups. The materials are drafted in a way that they can be sort of an add-on to any format, of course. So whether it's very short, language specific, or language generic, or even very long, you can adapt the different content to your own needs in a specific training that you're conducting. As Sonja said, the main angle was train the trainers, so they are the primary group, but it might still be interesting for all the others to have a look at them as well in case you ever need the modules or the topics in your own work. We have an QR code here. You can scan it and you come directly on the page where you have to sign in shortly with an email address, but then you immediately get access to the materials. I'd like to
showcase one more example. Yes, where the focus is on stakeholder cooperation, or that was developed through stakeholder cooperation. It's a similar type of training material, the so-called Handbook of Interpreters in Asylum Proceedings. You see the picture, the title picture of the manual on this slide here. And this is is the result of a long-term collaboration with UNHCR as one important international stakeholder in different migration contexts. The initial idea was to draft a very small training outline for training interpreters for an asylum context. And when we started back in 2014 already with the original German version, we soon found that there was much more to say about this topic than we could fit into the 20 or 30 pages we had originally planned for. So we finally ended up with a, now in the latest version, almost 270 pages training manual. And this again caters to different target groups. On the one hand, it can be used by trainers as a kind of train the trainers material also. And it can also be used as background information by trainees to use it to prepare for this context, and so that it can, if you use it in training, that trainees can use it to get additional information. The original German version was also first internationalized then for an English version, which is also now already available in its second edition. In this English version, we took out the original Austria-specific content to make it more usable for a larger European context. And this English version was then again retranslated and relocalized for different other language contexts. At the moment, it is available, for instance, for Armenian, for French, for Spanish and Russian. And this was also again a development we had not anticipated at the beginning when we first started with this project. You can find this book on, you can see on the slide here, and all the other language versions on RefWorld. This is one information channel used by UNHCR. You can use the QR code here, and we will then also post in the links, as we already said. So what was our main takeaway from this project? I feel it was that it's possible to use research-based content and to make it accessible for different target groups. That it's important to try to include content and use a language that ideally caters to different target groups, and to use a range of different content and materials to let users choose what they need for their specific training needs and contexts. And on the next slide, you can see one example of one of the chapters in this book. This one is, we picked it because it is important also for interpreting in a reception context, interpreting for groups, for larger groups, not just if you think of a three-party constellation that is typical for community interpreting in a migration context. There are sometimes larger groups you need to interpret for, and this is something you hear very little about these situations at the university, we felt. So this is why we chose this also as one example of the topics we discuss, and all the different chapters have a very similar structure. They always have learning outcomes at the beginning, and then they have a theory part, and then they have fact boxes with additional information and also literature, and then they have a large part with many different kinds of activities and instructions and what you can do in class. So what is there left to say? about this topic we tried to share with you today. We tried to spin, the red thread from starting with collaboration over different contexts and perspectives and resource management and how to use these kinds of materials. So to come back to my question, what is there left to say? A lot. We think there is a lot left to say, and there would be a lot left to do. And some ideas is, I'll start with the first one.
In terms of collaboration, a lot of projects have been working in this direction, but we of course would wish for more stakeholder collaboration, also on an international scale. All the examples that we share today are very much European based because it's the context where we have been working on the past few years or few decades in Sonja's case. But it would be equally interesting to expand the collaboration, to have other contexts included, different perspectives included, but also to manage the resources wisely that we have already. So as Sonja said, with the handbook, it was not anticipated to be translated in many, many languages, but in fact it was necessary, and we made the same experience with the ReTrans stories. So we've used them in different training contexts, and sometimes they were all drafted in English. It would be useful to have them in other languages as well. So one thing to be considered also for the future would be to have the available materials translated into other languages, or to think about drafting multilingual training materials in future projects.
And one other issue we thought about is that ideally it would also be great to involve as many different stakeholders as possible to gain an insight into different perspectives as widely as possible. We have tried to do this with some of our corporations. Sometimes it's difficult to access people you need gatekeepers sometimes in this field to be able to approach certain groups. But we feel that there is a lot to be gained from trying this. And ideally, as Maria said, the material should be used and reused and adapted for different contexts. And also with a view to research, this is also something we feel it would be great to do even more research on these contexts, also action research on such projects and on how these materials are used and how useful they appear for users. And also to write about these perspectives and use it for interpreter education, which we feel is a topic that is not always too popular if you want to submit a paper somewhere. But we feel that there is that you can learn a lot from such a perspective. There would be many more things to say, but I think we'll conclude.
Yeah, we conclude that research would be also, as we've experienced it, great to have students included, but also with the necessary support that they might need when they are going out into the field and working on such topics. But they have sometimes insights and access that scholars don't have anymore, or also other ideas that are very much beneficial to be included as well. But yes, I think that's more or less it, what we had to share today. Sonja posted all the links in the chat, so feel free to explore, expand, use, distribute. Jan, you're back. Thank you.